Hey guys, for those of you that don't know me, I have been a challenger player since set 3. In preparation for set 9's release, I've been playing a ton of games on PvE and also watching a ton of streams, trying to get a good read on the meta before set 9 officially releases. And in this video, I have finally compiled a list of what I think are the strongest comps you could possibly play on set 9. And without further ado, let's jump right into the comp guide. First comp I'm going to start off the video with is going to be Shurima. Shurima is an AP comp and is also one of the comps that has the highest cap. For example, if you just look at this board, the 4 core units to Shurima are all 4 and 5 cost units. You have Azir, which is a 4 cost, Nasus, which is a 4 cost, Jarvan, which is 4 cost, and K'Sante, which is a 5 cost. So it makes sense to roll for this comp at level 8 instead of level 7, because if you end up rolling at 7, you're probably not going to end up hitting any of these units 2 stars. So this really is a more high roll comp where you could snowball your lead and play into this comp to secure your first. So, however, the problem with this comp is a lot of these units are very unlikely to hit 2-star, even if you roll down at level 8. For example, most of the time on your roll down, you're probably going to get just an Azir 2 and maybe a Jarvan 2 if you're lucky. If not the Jarvan 2, probably the Nasus 2. And just forget about getting the K'Sante because K'Sante is a 5 cost. So you're most likely going to end up having to settle with a fucking Renekton. So basically, your initial board for Shurima is most likely going to look something like this. This is probably the most vanilla version of Shurima you could get. You're just playing the 5 basic Shurima units, and then you basically splash in the Sejuani for 2 Bruiser, and you splash in the Ashe, and it gives you Freljord, and it also gives you Deadeye. However, if you notice in this comp, you're playing a ton of shitter units, for example, Renekton, Talia, Akshan, and you could probably even drop the Ashe later. To cap out this board, you want to eventually drop all 4 of these shitter units and play into the 5 cost legendaries. Before I go into that though, I do want to note that if you happen to get the Shurima +1, this gives you the opportunity to play into 7 Shurima, and the only Shurima you're missing is going to be Cassiopeia. So you just play Cassiopeia, you probably drop the Ashe or something, and this is your board. However, even with this variation, it's not highest cap just because you're playing too many shitters. Ideally, late game, you do want to play around the late game units. As I said before, Azir, Nasus, Jarvan, K'Sante, and Aatrox. Aatrox is good because it is also a Juggernaut along with Nasus. And then if you notice, usually you're level 9 with this board, you have 4 open slots. There are a lot of different options you could go. You could pretty much splash in any legendary you want. If you have a lot of AP items or you have blue buff, you just throw in a random Ahri. If you have a lot of AP items and you have a Shojin, Ryze is good. Ryze is probably the premier Shojin holder. So alternatively, instead of playing these 2, you also have the opportunity to play Gwen, because Gwen is a Slayer if you already have the Aatrox. You could even splash in the late game challenger duo. The late game challenger duo includes something like a Kai'Sa and a Yasuo. Pretty much you just splash in any 2-star 4 cost or 5 cost you hit into the late game, and your board is just going to be insane because the main 5 core units for Shurima is just going to be these 5 units. For itemization, Azir really likes Guinsoo's, and Azir really likes AP items. So Deathcap is good, Archangels is good, JG is good, GS is good, Guardbreaker is good. Ideally, all of your tank items want to go on your Jarvan. And for Nasus, Nasus really likes Bruiser-ish items, stuff like Titans, BT. But eventually, if you manage to hit the Aatrox 2, you do want to somehow transfer over all of the Nasus items onto your Aatrox if possible. And all of your tank items are better off on your K'Sante if you hit K'Sante 2-star for highest cap. So the next comp I'm going to be covering is going to be Gunnar Zeri. So Zeri is yet another comp that you could play, and it's usually a roll down for at level 8. Although there are a lot of 4 cost units in this comp that you want to roll for, that actually isn't the only reason it's a level 8 comp. The reason why this is a level 8 comp is because you usually play into Zeri from the Piltover opener. So if you guys don't know, Piltover, it's basically the gambling degen trait of set 9. Basically, you gain stacks for every time you lose, and then once you cash out once, all the power goes into your T-Rex. However, in Piltover, the thing is, you actually generally want to play around the T-Rex for your late game just because you lack the front line. And the T-Rex really helps out with the distribution of a good front line and the back line balance. So basically, you basically play Piltover from the early game. You usually sack the 5 rounds early. You might roll down a bit at stage 3-2 to stabilize your board. And then it will enable you to win streak generally all the way until level 8. And you could roll down again for a Zeri board, something like this. And you're going to have the T-Rex as your front line. And if you manage to hit the Heimer later, you get the turret, and you get the self-repair upgrades on your turret. You put the turret in the front line for another good frontline unit to have the good balance between a front line and a back line. One thing to note about Gunner is that Gunner already gives you a shitload of base AD from the trait itself. What this means is that you don't want to be building items that give Zeri more AD. You kind of want to distribute your stats more in a way to multiply, or in a way to make your stats work together to multiply the amount of damage you give. For example, since you already have such a high base AD, you usually want IE because you crit off the already high base AD. Last Whisper is also good. Hodge is also really good comboed with the IE. QSS is decent as well. Basically, any attack speed or AD items, or any attack speed or items that crit off the already high base AD is really good for Zeri. The main variation, or like the most common variation, is going to be 3 Piltover, 4 Zon, and 4 Gunner. So your board is generally going to look something like this. However, there are a few other variations you could play for Gunner Zeri. For example, there is this variation going around where you can play around 6 Zon. The reason why 6 Zon is good is because there is one of the Zon upgrades where it makes your unit explode. And if you put it on Jarvan, Jarvan just ends up ulting into their team. And when he dies, he just deals a shitload of damage to your team, and then your Zeri just cleans up their backline. In this variation, you don't actually play around 4 Gunner, you just play around 2 just because you need to fit in 6 Zon. Note that 6 Zon is only accessible for a Zon +1, just because there are only 5 Zon units in the game. Some other good splashing units include Cassante and Shen and Ryze. This gives you the combination of Invoker and Bastion, and these are all insanely strong late game units as well. So Zeri does really have a high access to a fully capped out board late game as well. So the next really strong comp I'll be covering is going to be Ionia Challengers. So this comp really revolves around 4 main core units. It's going to be Shen, Yasuo, Kai'Sa, and Ahri. If you notice, this comp, the 4 core units of this comp are all 4 and 5 cost units, and you're most likely not hitting this Ahri. Realistically, this is probably just going to be something like a Karma. So as you can see here, because all these units are so expensive, it's a relatively high roll comp, and you really do want to roll for this comp at level 8. So ideally, you want a really strong early game board with this comp, something like Irelia 2-star, Jhin 2-star. You get the 3rd Ionia unit, something like a Set, and that will be able to win streak you all the way until level 8, and you can transition into this board. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't try to play this board from behind. However, itemization for this comp, Yasuo really likes the Bruiser items, so this is actually BT, Hodge, IE, Titans are all really good in Yasuo. GS is good as well. And if you happen to see the challengers, Warwick is probably the best item holder you could get for Yasuo because he uses the exact same items as Yasuo. So late game, you just sell off the Warwick and move all your items to your Yasuo. Kai'Sa is a unit that uses attack speed and AP items pretty well. I think she does a bit better with something like AP. So for example, just a basic Shiv is really good on her. Morello is okay on her because she only spreads it to 4 units. Death Cap is good. I also think Shojin is pretty good too. Ideally, I think you want to prioritize itemizing your Yasuo because Yasuo is going to be your primary carry, and you just put all of your leftover items on your Kai'Sa. So where do we go from here? We have these 4 units. What level 8 boards can we play around? I think the most common variation you could play around is going to be something like this. It's the most consistent thing you could hit because all of the other units are relatively low cost. You play around 6 Ionia and 4 Challenger. One thing to note is that if you end up hitting an Ionia +1, you could probably end up dropping the Zed. You just put the Ionia spat on the Senna. Additionally, if you also hit the Ahri, you can play the Ahri as well. This will give you 6 Ionia, and Ahri is your late game win condition because Ahri is one of the strongest 5 cost units in the game right now. She's also a really good blue buff holder and holds AP items extremely well. So this is going to be the vanilla variation. Obviously, you're playing a lot of shitter units, for example, Irelia, Set, Karma, Kalista. Ideally, every comp has some kind of variation that plays around all of the legendaries, and the variation for this is going to look something like this. Here, you just drop out of all the shitty units, and the main core units is, like I said before, Shen, Yasuo, Kai'Sa, and Ahri. And then you just fill your board with all of the random 5 cost legendaries you find. So for example, in this scenario, I play Senna, Cassante, and Aatrox. And because I'm dual carrying my challengers, I just play 2 additional challengers. Warwick is good because it gives me Juggernaut, and Kalista is just a random 4th, pretty decent challenger actually, to round out my synergies. Additionally, you could drop these 2 if you want to. For example, you could probably play something like a Belvith. You could also consider playing something like a Ryze. Ryze is what I was looking for. But yeah, this is the late game Omega Cap version of the challenger board. So the next AD comp I'm going to be covering is going to be Freljord Aphelios. So Aphelios is actually pretty easy to play because you only need to remember 1 unit and 1 trait. you're just going to be playing Aphelios, and you just need to be playing all of the Freljord units, which is going to be Sejuani, Lysandra, and Ashe. Ashe is both a Freljord and your second Deadeye you want to play. Lysandra is an amazing supporting unit because it amplifies your team's damage, and she applies Morello really well, and Sejuani is probably one of the best frontline units in the game right now. So the other units are all splashable. You just play whatever you want. You play more frontline. You can also go the 4 Deadeye approach. And I also think that Aphelios is one of the more acceptable comps to roll at 7, just because you have a lot more things to hit that aren't 4 costs. For example, you could probably roll for a solid frontline if you hit like a random Tarek 2 and like a random Shen 1. This is like acceptable, and you're going to have a good amount of damage to last you until level 8. Additionally, you have a lot of other shit you can hit too. For example, if you notice, the 2 other Deadeye units are in the 1 to 4 cost range. So if you already have the Jin 2 and you hit like a random Akshan 2, your board is also pretty solid at level 7 as well. So this is why I think that this is a more acceptable comp to roll for at level 7. So for Aphelios, Aphelios really likes AD and attack speed items. Stuff like IE is good, Deathblade is good, Runans is good, Hodge is good, Gwynsu's is good as well, GS, Guardbreaker. Aphelios also has access to pretty high cap. I do think that right now Aphelios is a bit weaker than Zeri. However, this might change once the meta settles in a bit. But another variation you could play is going to look something like this. The primary units you want to splash in are going to be a second Bruiser to fit in with the Sejuani. You also want to consider playing another Targon unit. Something like a Tarek is really good. You don't have to play into 4 Deadeye. You could splash in more legendary units. For example, Shen might be good here. This gives you a Bastion and Invoker. Additionally, you could also fit in a random legendary unit you hit later as well. Something like an Ahri, random Ahri if you have like a blue buff or AP items. Random Rise is good as well. Random Kusante. One thing that I do want to note is that you probably don't want to play around 4 Deadeye unless you get the Deadeye +1. The only reason is because you're playing around too many shit units. But if you do get the Deadeye +1, you probably want to end up playing the Senna. Senna is a very insane unit for this comp, and she's also an insanely good holder for the Deadeye spat. Now you have 3 Deadeye, you just want to fit in 1 more. I believe Urgot is the best Deadeye you could play in this situation, and in this case you probably drop the Shen or something, and then your board will look something like this, pretty strong. All the damage items go on your Aphelios, and all of the tank items go on your Sejuani, and all leftover items go on either your Urgot or your Senna. So the last comp I'll be covering in this video is going to be the Bruiser Void comp. So the Bruiser Void comp is very tempo oriented just because it relies on you winning most of your early game fights, because the early and mid game for this board is extremely powerful, especially if you get Sunfire Cape. Your frontline is just extremely strong, and if you manage to get the right frontline items and a decent backline carry, you will probably win most of your early and mid game fights. However, this comp does get outscaled late game, but it will almost always get you a guaranteed top 4. So the core variation to this comp is going to just involve 4 Bruisers and 3 Void. Eventually, you do want to drop this Bruiser for Scion. However, there are a few ways to play this comp. So one way to play this variation is to actually reroll for Rek'Sai. So since Rek'Sai is a 3 cost unit, you want to reroll for Rek'Sai at level 7. So if you remember from set 8, there was this Jax comp. This comp is very similar to the Jax comp where you slow roll at level 7 for Rek'Sai 3, and the main tank instead of Riven 3 is going to be Vi 3. So you put all of your tank items on your Vi. The main items for Rek'Sai are going to be Bruiser items, so Hodge, BT, Titans, all of these items are really good, typical Bruiser items. If you don't want to play this way and you just want to play tempo, you could just tempo into a standard level 8 board that involves playing around Kaisa. So one variation you could play just involves playing 6 Bruisers. You play the legendary San unit, which is a Bruiser. You just play all the other Bruiser units in the game. You play 3 Void, and you dual carry your Kaisa and your Kalista, and you put all of your leftover items on your Scion, all your tank items on your Sejuani. So Kaisa really likes AP items. I think some really good items for her include Shiv, Archangels is quite good, GS is quite good, Deathcap is quite good, Guardbreaker is quite good, and Kalista is pretty decent with just something like a Gwynsu's. Now, you don't have to play into the 6 Bruiser variant. The other variant you can play is just going to be playing around Void. So the breakpoints for Void are going to be 3, 6, and 8. At 3, you just get a small Void Shitter you can place anywhere on your board. 6, you get a Rift Herald, and 8, you get Baron Nashor. So 6 is a pretty formidable unit you could play, but however, you could only play into 8 if you get the Void +1. So don't even bother going for this. But if you do get the Void +1, your board might look something like this. Here, I would probably just end up playing a second challenger just to boost up my main Kai'Sa's damage, which is going to be my Kaisa. So something like a Yasuo, you just place the Void Emblem on your Yasuo, and you can put all your AP items on your Kaisa and all of your Bruiser-ish items on your Bel'Veth. I think the best place to put Baron is probably second row, just to make sure Baron doesn't die instantly, but at least gets the knockup. Finally, if you don't get the Void +1, you just play a board like this. You play around 6 Void and 4 Bruiser. Primary carry the Kaisa. You might not have Bruiser items on your Rek'Sai, but you also might have some if you use Rek'Sai to tempo into level 8. And you put all of your leftover items from Carousel onto your Bel'Veth and just play for top 4. So this sums up my set 9 comps guide. If you guys enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you guys subscribe to my YouTube channel or followed me on Twitch. In a few days, once the meta settles in a bit, I'm going to be releasing my first flex guide of set 9, where I go over how to play the early, mid, and late game for the set, also what items to slam and what augments are the best to play in the current meta. Yep, that's it. I'll see you guys next time.